Good evening, everyone. I am Lauren McCormick, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Walnut Creek Library Foundation's first program of 2025 in our Live from the Library series of free evenings with authors, scholars, community leaders, and entertainers. I want to thank our Live from the Library season sponsors, Minuteman Press of Lafayette, and the Friends of the Walnut Creek Library. And on behalf of the Walnut Creek Library Foundation, I want to thank each of you for your support. You support us just by being here, and some of you provide financial support as well. And that's important because even though these programs are free, it does cost money to put them on. Here's a quick look at some of the programs that the Walnut Creek Library Foundation has sponsored recently with your help. If you're already a donor, again, congratulations and thank you. And you can become a donor here and now by putting a few dollars into the tip jar at the back of the room, or by visiting the Walnut Creek Library Foundation website at www.wclibrary.org. Just a quick housekeeping note, you may hear some closure announcements leading up to 8 p.m. Please don't be alarmed, we will all still be able to exit the building after that. Leta McCollough Seletzky is a National Endowment for the Arts 2022 Creative Writing Fellow whose work has been featured in The Atlantic, The New York Times, the Oprah Magazine, and The Washington Post, among other publications. She is the author of The Kneeling Man, My Father's Life as a Black Spy Who Witnessed the Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. But Leta is also a supermom, a local, and a strong and valued voice in many spheres from writing to politics. In addition to all of these things, she is a pure delight, and I was thrilled that she accepted our invitation to speak to Lisa Wren, our journalist and foundation colleague, and all of you this evening. So now, without further ado, allow me to introduce Leta McCollough Seletzky.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for that beautiful introduction. I really appreciate it. I want to thank the Walnut Creek Library Foundation for inviting me here tonight. It's such an honor to be here. And thanks so much to you all for coming as well, and to all the staff who helped to put this together. This is just such a joy. And so I'm going to begin by reading a short selection from my book, The Kneeling Man, My Father's Life as a Black Spy Who Witnessed the Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And so it's just going to be a brief reading from Chapter 1, Scene 1, called Explosion. On Thursday, April 4th, 1968, just before 6 in the evening, 5 people stepped onto the parking lot of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis and beheld a spectacle. No more than 10 yards away, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was leaning on the teal railing of the motel's second-floor balcony, talking to a small crowd below. He and the crowd were laughing, their words just beyond hearing range, as the last rays of sunlight glinted off the motel's rectangular picture windows. The group of 5 had been split between 2 cars, a cobalt blue Volkswagen Fastback and a white Pontiac Tempest, having just come from Claiborne Temple, where they were helping with grassroots efforts to support the city's striking sanitation workers. Their work wove an easy kinship between them, though one, the Volkswagen's driver, seemed a little quieter than the rest when conversation got going. They knew him as Morrell, the 23-year-old Minister of Transportation for a Black militant group called the Invaders. Others called him Mac. Just before noon that day, Mac had encountered 3 of them deep in conversation at the church. "Hey, let's see if Morrell will take us," said Clara, a brown-skinned student activist in bobby socks, as she gestured toward him. Standing beside her was Mary, another student activist, also in bobby socks. "Take you where?" he asked. "Shopping for 4-button overalls," Baby Jesus said. "I need 'em for the march." Baby Jesus was what they called James Orange, aide to Dr. King and project coordinator for his Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. The nickname was ironic, given the man's 6'3", 300-pound frame. He towered over Mac, himself not a small man at a muscular 6 feet tall, plus a 2-inch afro. But baby Jesus's long goatee sprouted from a cherubic ebony face with gentle eyes, framed by horn-rimmed glasses. He'd been in town all week with colleagues from the SCLC, preparing for King's next big march for the sanitation workers. They piled into Mac's car, first stopping at the shops along Main Street. Finding nothing, they checked the venerable old Goldsmith's department store downtown, which carried a variety of menswear, but not the overalls. Someone recommended checking the new Sears out east on Poplar Avenue. No luck. The pattern repeated itself all over town as they combed store after store without success. Finally, they returned to Claiborne Temple, where they ran into the fiery and slightly built James Bevel, who managed the SCLC's direct action and nonviolent education programs. By now, it was getting close to dinner time. Baby Jesus invited the college students to share a meal at the Lorraine, the SCLC's base of operations in Memphis. Bevel was planning to head there too, and it made sense for Mac to come along. The SCLC had rented the Invaders a couple of rooms while the two groups were in talks about the role the Invaders might play in the upcoming march. The 5 of them decided to carpool over, with Mac driving baby Jesus and Bevel while Clara drove Mary. Dressed in jeans and a lightweight pullover jacket, Mac walked toward Clara's car, parked behind his. He recognized a few people in the crowd near King's balcony, members of a gospel group called the Operation Breadbasket Band. Orange and Bevel walked in their direction. Mac exchanged a few words with Clara and Mary. Just then, a thunderous boom echoed through the air. Mac looked up and saw King fall backward to the balcony floor. "Dr. King has been shot," screamed someone in the crowd. Mac looked out in the direction opposite where King had been standing, toward a couple of ramshackle buildings across Mulberry Street. He saw no one, either in the buildings or on the ground. His eyes swept the parking lot, the street, the sidewalks. No one running, no one with a gun. He looked at the balcony again. One of King's aides, Reverend Jesse Jackson, peered out from behind an adjacent window toward King's fallen body. The next thing Mac knew, his legs were carrying him toward King, sprinting up an external staircase and onto the second-floor balcony. Had he stopped to consider a course of action and the possible consequences, he probably would have melted into the crowd, but something automatic propelled him. As he reached the balcony, it occurred to him that the shooter might not be finished. He dropped to a crawl and made his way to King, grabbing a white towel from a cleaning cart along the way. Mac's eyes locked on the gaping hole in the right side of King's head and neck as it gushed blood onto the gray concrete. The wound began around his cheekbone, traveling down under his Adam's apple. It looked strange, the way the flesh erupted outward, torn back. Droplets of blood speckled the front of King's shirt, from the collar to the middle of the torso. Mac's mind searched for methods to stop the bleeding. There were only 2. A tourniquet, which obviously wouldn't work here, and pressure. He pressed the towel into the wound. Who did this? He wondered. Where did the shot come from? Thank you.
Thank you, Leta. This is quite a story. I just finished the book this week, and it is a treat. I've learned so much. And I so appreciate you being here, and I know everybody else does, too. Let's start. Why don't you tell us how you first discovered what an interesting life your father had led and was still leading, and what compelled you to write the book?
Yes. So I learned about my father's story really very slowly and then really fast. So I grew up with the knowledge from the earliest age that it was my father in this photograph that you can see on the screen here. kneeling beside Dr. King, trying to administer first aid. I mean, I always kind of grew up with that knowledge. And what my brother and I were told by our mother was that, this is a famous photograph, this is your father, he was a Memphis police officer. And that was really the end of the discussion. And kids can really kind of pick up on, from the tone in which something is said and in the context, when something really is not up for much discussion. And so this was one of those things that we knew just instinctively, this is not something that we talk about. And so that's all really that was ever said about this photo. And so it wasn't until I was in high school and an avid newspaper reader, because I grew up in kind of a journalist-heavy environment. My mom was a newspaper editor and reporter, and I know you're a journalist as well. My stepfather was a journalist, so I read the newspaper every day. I'd come home from, elementary school, middle school, high school, and pick up the Memphis Commercial Appeal and go through the paper. And so one day in high school, I was looking through the newspaper, and there was an article that featured this photograph talking about how there was a Black undercover police officer on the scene of the assassination. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting, because my dad was also there. and I read a little further, oh, he was infiltrating an activist group. And I thought, well, that's too bad, because by this time I was also developing kind of a social awareness. And, I'd read about these kinds of activist groups in the 60s, the Black Panthers and things like that. So when I, read the part about the invaders, it instantly put in my mind, oh, like the Black Panthers of Oakland, the Huey Newton. And I thought, oh, well, that's terrible. This man infiltrated this group, And then the name was there, and it was my father's name, Leta McCollough. And I was devastated. I was so, the emotions that I felt, it was shock, it was embarrassment, and then I kind of thought, well, this is in the paper, what are people going to say? Am I going to have to deal with this at school? Like the other kids are going home reading the paper like I was. But, what about their parents, And so, I saw this information, and then I think also working in my mind was the idea that, oh, well, this is why nobody ever talked about, the fact that, they never said anything more than he was a police officer. And so my response was really just to go along with that silence that had already been there. But, now this was more of a silence with a purpose, because I just really didn't want this topic coming out and having to deal with it. And so I really just kind of buried it for a long time. And then, so this is when things start to quickly sort of pick up speed. So then, as I grow even older and I leave town, go off to college, and this is the advent of the internet. I mean, this is the 1900s, so the internet is, coming onto the scene. And so, pretty soon, by the time I'm, junior, senior in college and thereafter, you can search the internet and find all kinds of things. And I remember coming across things about my dad doing these internet searches and kind of conspiracy websites about his presence on the scene, the fact that he was an undercover officer, people, suggesting or outright saying that he was involved in the murder of Dr. King. And so, again, I just kind of buried it. And I kept silent about it. I mean, even now I go back and I talk to people, that I knew back then, and I ask them, did I ever mention this? And most of them say, no, you didn't. But then there came a point after, I was out of school, went to law school, graduated, started practicing law, had kids. Suddenly that silence started to feel more burdensome. And I thought about the implications of passing that down to my children. And I thought, that's really not fair to do that to them. And so I felt a responsibility to find out what the truth was rather than have that fear and that can of worms. And then I also felt a responsibility just as a custodian of a puzzle piece of history. My dad has this story that's never been told. He had never, as it turned out, ever told anyone the full story that's in this book. He had been carrying this burden as well. And so that is when I decided to break that silence and get the story. And then, I did say that there came a point when I learned the story quickly, but it was really a process of about 7 years of interviews of my dad. But, in the scheme of things, it did seem like it rapidly unfurled and became this book.
And in the process of that book, at one point, you get a call from Ambassador Andrew Young, correct? Or he contacted you and wanted to talk to you, and I remember you saying in writing in the book you were hesitant because you were nervous about it, but you did end up going and visiting him. Tell us about that a little bit.
Yes, and that was quite the story as well. So, kind of a side quest, I guess, as the kids say, because Ambassador Andrew Young was one of Dr. King's closest aides. He also is in this photograph pointing, in fact, I believe he's the man standing nearest my father in the photo, pointing in the direction from which the shot came. And so he had been in touch with one of my mom's colleagues at the Memphis Commercial Appeal and had said, years before I had the idea to get the story or write the book, he had said that he wanted to talk to my dad. Now, by this time, my parents, had been divorced. They divorced when I was a small child. But he passed the word through this reporter to my mom to give to my dad through me that he wanted to talk to my dad. And my dad always shut it down. It was just kind of a non-starter for him. And so that's the way it was for many years until I started asking about this story. And what I really did was, one day I called my dad out of the blue. I had, these 2 kids. I'm on hiatus from law practice. And so I just called my dad like it was a normal phone call. And after a little bit of chit chat and pleasantries, I said, yeah, so, we never talked about the assassination of Dr. King, that whole, I would like to know about that. And so after a few beats of silence, he sounded kind of relieved. It was almost like he laughed a little bit and said, well, I'll send you some notes and then we'll go from there. But in that early process, that's when I started thinking again about Ambassador Young's offer, or actually desire, to speak with my dad. I brought it up again. My dad said no again, but I had Andrew Young's phone number from the reporter. So I called Andrew Young one day out of the blue and talked to him, had a great conversation that's detailed in this book. And after I did that and related the conversation to my dad, including an offer to come to Andrew Young's home in Atlanta and speak with him personally, my dad finally relented after years of badgering. And so we flew down to Atlanta. We went to Andrew Young's home, sat in his den, and spent an afternoon unpacking.
And there was a lot to unpack.
Yes.
And so let's back up a little bit, because as you said, you had part of the puzzle, but there's a lot of context involved in here. And this is one of the things I especially appreciated about the book, is learning about the life your father had lived, essentially the son of sharecroppers in Mississippi, and just trying to get a foothold in the world and get a job. And he was an ambitious man, and I say that in the most positive, complimentary kind of sense. He wanted to have a life. He wanted something more. And to him, just trying to get through high school because of the school segregation issue, which was still, I can't remember exactly where it was there, but it was not an easy thing. And he wanted to go to college. And so talk a little bit about his younger life and how he ended up as a Memphis cop, and how he ended up suddenly, as a spy.
Yes, and I mean, again, that is such a remarkable story that surprised me when I heard it. It was something that I never would have guessed or imagined, just based on the surface of things. So my father was born, Morel McCullough, in 1944 in Tunica County, Mississippi, which was one of the poorest counties in the United States of America. Born one of 12 children, I believe the fourth youngest of the 12, to these parents who were sharecropping on rented land at a certain point. And they had started off, his earliest years, he remembers them as being a happy time, because children, the way that they see the world is, they see it with such simplicity and purity. And he just remembers that, in his, first 4 or 5 years of life, they had this farm. And, at that point, they weren't sharecropping. They were just growing cotton and sorghum and things like that on this farm. But then his mother fell ill. She ended up dying, leaving his father, Walter, with these kids to raise. No longer can they afford to rent the farm. So then they end up sharecropping and really becoming itinerant. In a sense, and that's when he specifically recalls having the thought around age 5 or 6 that we're poor now. Their clothes are no longer getting mended or replaced. They no longer have shoes. Suddenly, they're not going to school anymore. I mean, the younger ones. And so he remembers just running around aimlessly in the yard with his younger brother, missing 2-3 years of school, however long, until things get stabilized again. But again, I mean, this is the heart and the heat of Jim Crow. And so with everything that you might imagine. And so the school, everything was entirely segregated. But once he was able to get back in school and kind of get into the community, and the church was a big factor as part of the social fabric, the adults around him recognized that he had this spark, he had this desire to learn, and he was really good in the classroom, and they would give them passages to memorize and come back and recite for the class, and he would do such a good job that the principal would take him around to the older kids. Now, mind you, this is a 2-room schoolhouse, so they don't have to go very far, but would take him and show the kids, look at this, look at what the student can do. And so his goal becomes, very early in life, to get educated and to really do something to become who he can become. And so, at a certain point, it's clear that, the family's never going to have enough money to send him to school. And plus, where's he going to go in this environment anyway? And so the GI Bill becomes the way, and going through the military. And he had a couple of older siblings who had gone through the Army. And so he ends up enlisting in the Army, which is kind of a problematic situation, because what ends up happening, and I don't want to spoil anything in the book, but it happens kind of under less than honest circumstances on the part of the recruiter. So he ends up ending his high school career to join the Army. But what that does is it gives him some structure that was kind of shaky in the way that he grew up. It gets him out of the Mississippi Delta and allows him to see the world. And, ultimately it helps him to access higher education. But that is the way that he's able to get out. However, once he starts down this track, on one hand, it's a track to freedom. It's a track to self-determination. But there are limitations on that track. Once you've enlisted, then you're in a certain world. And not to say that, he couldn't have participated in social movements like the civil rights movement or things like that, but certainly your path is circumscribed. And so that really laid the path that ultimately led him into this photo.
Right, and he became a police officer, and very early on, they just tapped him and said, oh, this is your job. You need to go infiltrate.
That's right. And the way that happened too was very, it was very strange in a way. I mean, I guess I would say synchronistic in that he never planned to be a police officer. I mean, in fact, he was kind of interested in agriculture, with his upbringing. He thought, well, what about the science of agriculture? But when he enlisted in the Army, he had to take an exam. And the result of that exam placed him in military police school. So it's kind of like, okay, well, you're law enforcement now in the military. You're a policeman. So, okay. So he goes through that. He does that. He's an MP. He serves his 3 years, gets out just as, Vietnam is really heating up. But, he's honorably discharged. And he comes out, and instead of going back to Mississippi, he goes to Memphis, which is kind of the closest big city to the Mississippi Delta. People joke that Memphis is the capital of Mississippi, which, But in any event, he has some relatives who are there. And so he sets about the task of trying to get a job because, his thinking is, well, now I'm in Memphis, this is a city where I'll have a shot, and now I've got this military record, so certainly I'll be able to start my job, start my career, begin my life. But only one problem, nobody will hire him. He can't get a job. He's, walking the pavement day after day, responding to ads. No one will hire him. And so he ends up working for one of his cousins who takes pity on him, this minimum wage job, which I think minimum wage was $1.60 an hour or something. This is 1967. Working in a sash and door company and then working in a motorboat repair company. And so they work these 2 shifts back to back. They get up when it's dark. They work one shift, go to the next job, work the second shift, come home, it's getting dark, and, eat, go to bed, and do the same thing over and over again. And he thinks, okay, well, this is my life. I, went into the Army to try to, to attain this career, and this is the career that I can attain. But it just so happens that one day, he and his cousin, Eugene, are driving to the Sash and Door Company one morning, and they're listening to talk radio, and an ad comes on the radio, and it's a recruiting ad for the Memphis Police Department. And it's, it's got these sirens in the background, like, woo, woo, be a Memphis police officer. Come on down to the police department headquarters, we're hiring. And so his cousin Eugene turns to him and says, hey, weren't you a military police officer? You ought to go down there and apply for that. And my dad is just incredulous. He's already tried to get a job, and jobs that have much less responsibility than wearing a badge and being a police officer in 1967 Memphis. And so he says, there's no way that they're going to hire me in this town for that job. But Eugene says, well, you don't know that. You should just go down there and try. So he goes down and applies, and they make him jump through all of these hoops. It's a lot of extra, that's detailed in the book, but ultimately he gets the job. One of the very few black officers that they have. I mean, at the time, I think Memphis was about 35% black, and the police force was maybe 5.5% black. So, they're not making great headway with their diversity, but he ends up becoming, one of their latest recruits. And so it's a normal job at first, right, until this historic sanitation strike breaks out that brings Dr. King to town.
And there's a lot about that in the book, and I'm not going to go into it. I'm not going to ask you to. It's very, very complicated, but you really get a sense in reading the book why he made all the decisions he made, and that he held his dignity and his honor, and ultimately, he goes on to have quite the career at the CIA. And I mean, that's a big leap forward, but that, in other words, he wasn't a police officer the rest of his life. He went on and he had a great career with that. And I want to segue a little bit into you too, because as his daughter and as the writer, before you were a lawyer, you actually interned at the CIA.
I did.
So tell me a little bit about that and why you did that.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting because that actually does come up, in these conversations. And certainly the CIA angle has been just pure fodder for the conspiracy theories, of course, because, and I mean, I can understand why that might be. Like, look, here you have this guy, he was undercover for the Memphis police. Okay, fine, that's already suspect. Then he goes on to the Central Intelligence Agency. Come on now, But there actually is a rational explanation for all this. It really does flow, but essentially the upshot is that he went on to the CIA because he hit a ceiling in Memphis, as one might imagine, and so the federal government was the opportunity. And so as the child of a CIA officer, at the time they had a program, I'm trying to remember what it was called, but I don't think it exists now, but the children of the officers had the opportunity to be interns there. And so I took that opportunity for 2 summers when I was in college. And it was super cool. I mean, in a way, what it brought home for me is that, at the end of the day, I mean, and the CIA is obviously a crucial part of our, intelligence structure and, of this nation, keeping us all safe. But it's also a federal agency. There are a whole lot of people who work there, many, many thousands. And, I mean, I've worked at different federal jobs, and it's a federal job. There are people who are working in the clandestine service, doing all the spy stuff and the disguises and all that. But, I mean, there are tons of administrative people, there are analysts. I mean, there are all kinds of jobs. And, I mean, it's, in some ways, it's a normal federal agency. And then in some ways, it's highly unique. But I was really just a regular intern. I mean, I don't know if my experience would have been that much different, at any of the other big agencies, except I was just, at the CIA, so.
Well, and then you went on to get a law degree at Georgetown.
George Washington.
George Washington, yes, Washington. And your husband, who's here, Dimitri, is a lawyer. And between the two of you, you've traveled quite a bit. His job took you to Kazakhstan?
Yes.
And is it Niger or Nigeria?
Yes, Nigeria.
Okay, and then I'm fast forwarding a whole lot because I'm going to make a point here. One of the things that struck me in reading the book is it starts when you're writing about the Memphis, arriving at the Memphis airport and how just like going home, it just, even though Memphis, it's not a perfect city, what city is, but it felt familiar and did a comparison about like just that and Atlanta and as thriving cities in the South and what they did right and wrong. But I was interested in that because other people who have grown up, at a place that they love, but they move somewhere else, you still have that sense of home there. And you write about it again when you're a child and you go visit your grandparents, and they have this, they have this really amazing property where they've got some farm stuff, and you just felt, my sense in the book, you felt really at home there, really comfortable and all of that, and you didn't go on to write like when you're living up in Tahoe, which is. There's a long story of why that is, but you find yourself living in Incline Village, Lake Tahoe, and in 2016, it's starting to feel a little bit weird.
Yeah.
Starting to be a lot of big pickup trucks around, and a sudden growth of flags that you hadn't seen before, and your reaction was kind of like, wait, why is that bothering me? It shouldn't be bothering me. It's our country's flag, but it feels like it's being sort of brandished in a menacing way. So,
yes.
And you end up at a dinner party where with some Trump supporters, and you just realize, man, I'm not feeling good here. So anyhow, you looked around to where to move, and you ended up here in Walnut Creek.
Yay!
And
yes.
And
I love it here.
Yeah, and I wanted one of the things that you that I want to just. There's a sentence in the book about it's one thing to be accepted, it's another thing to feel like you belong somewhere. And so I'm hoping you feel like you belong here in Walnut Creek.
Most definitely.
Okay, good.
Yes, and that's right. And yes, and you can feel that difference, right? from, between being tolerated somewhere or being, accepted, like we accept you,
Yeah.
to really belonging in a place, and a place really being home.
Yeah.
And I will say about those times, and I love Incline Village too, and I actually just got back from there, but it was more the time that we were in. 2016 was a very special time in history, kind of like, 1968. And, definitely mirrors in many ways 2024, I would say, and going into, now we're in 2025 and, the current events right now. And I just found myself feeling like there were certain tendencies in society that hadn't really been brought out, that were suddenly coming out and being welcomed, or being, speaking of things being tolerated, bad things being tolerated, and feeling like I didn't know, I thought I knew this community, but there's so much going on here that maybe I didn't know, things, that are starting to peek out. And just feeling that sense of disorientation and what's what. And so, yeah, definitely to kind of have to relive that feeling again is tough.
Right. But, and then one of the things, it's interesting, you live in the Tice Valley area, which is kind of rural, and there's a lot of land, and you got to sort of plant a lot of gardens and revisit the thing that takes you back to your, the thing your father loved, which was he wanted to be a farmer too, in a different way. So I think I'd like to open it up to audience now, because I think there's people here who have questions. Does anybody have a question? And do we have a microphone? All right. Lauren will be on that.
So I'll let these two decide who to call on, and then I will repeat the question so everybody can hear it. So, Lisa.
The gentleman back there.
Yeah, can you elaborate on the conversation between your father and Ambassador Young, please?
Yes, so this was a long conversation, a wide-ranging conversation, but, and it's interesting because I think my read on it was Andrew Young just wanted to hear from my father, what he was doing on that balcony, what he saw and experienced, and what was going on. But he never really came out and said that. And I mean, it really was to the point where, at a certain point when there was kind of a lull and I felt like, I think maybe I should say something here. I did say to Ambassador Young, I said, well, I know that you had reached out to my father, and he kind of denied it a little bit, like, oh, no, not really. I didn't have any particular, I mean, I can't remember exactly how he responded, but he was sort of, kind of distancing himself from this desire to have the conversation. At least that's the way I heard it. But I think that really was sort of what he had wanted to talk about. And likewise, I think my father finally felt comfortable and felt open enough at that point, after carrying all of what he experienced, by himself all these years. I think he finally felt like he was in a place where he could share his story and have Ambassador Young listen to it, as not only Dr. King's aide, but his close friend. And, even if, Ambassador Young didn't necessarily believe what he was saying, I mean, even if he didn't, which, I mean, I think that he did, but even if he didn't, just to be able to say, to have his say and just share his, truth of that day, I think was really important to him. And certainly after the conversation, he his whole face changed, like his whole bearing had changed. He just felt lighter, like riding in the car. Going back to my brother's house from this talk, he just seemed lighter in his being. But no, the conversation was about, of course, the day of the assassination, April 4th, 1968. Ambassador Young brought up a series of other mysterious deaths that happened among activists and leaders around that time. Of course, we all know about Bobby Kennedy, but also there was Walter Reuther. There was another, who was it? Thomas Merton, the priest, anti-war activist. There were some others. And so Ambassador Young, mentioned that it was just a lot of deaths among, this set of people, and, just kind of raising that issue. And then they started talking about, just different initiatives that Ambassador Young had undertaken and was currently involved in to help people. He talked about, just some different fundraising things that he was doing and different work that he had done, and being mayor of Atlanta, because he had gone on to become, a mayor of Atlanta, and working with the police in undercover sting operation, an operation to catch, it was like street harassers. And so he talked about, having that experience. So it was a beautiful conversation.
Sam in the back.
Thank you so much for sharing. I can't wait to read the book. I wondered if your father talked about how long he had infiltrated, and you said that your parents were divorced, so he was just kind of not sharing that probably with anyone. And did you find out information that was the Memphis police wanted to know?
Right, and so he did share all of this. He talked about this undercover operation, which was very brief. And at the very beginning of his tenure, as a newly minted patrol officer, he was a real rookie. He graduated from the police academy in December 1967. And was on foot patrol at a shopping center during the holidays, in his uniform, being seen by most of Black Memphis probably, and a lot of the rest. And then, so this was December, January, I think he starts car patrols going through certain neighborhoods. The policing was segregated, by the way. 1967, 68, Black officers were not assigned to white neighborhoods. So he was, assigned to these Black neighborhoods along with a more senior officer. So he's doing this. And then, so December, January, then February, the historic sanitation strike breaks out in Memphis, Tennessee, where these, sanitation workers who are almost entirely a Black workforce decide, that they're not going to take the poor working conditions, poor treatment, and terrible pay any longer. And so they, go on strike, and they want a union dues checkoff, they want union recognition, and they want better pay and better conditions, and they want more respect. And you've probably seen the signs, the placards that they carried that read, "I am a man." That was their iconic slogan, which gives me chills when I think about it. I am a human being. I really think this is the rallying cry for all marginalized people around the world. When you have the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equally. "I am a man" is a response to that, to say, well, I am created equally also. I am a human being. In any event, that's February. He's only been out, for 2 good months. But once that strike happens, law enforcement, the police department and the FBI field office, and I'm sure all the way up to the top, J. Edgar Hoover, most likely, they're concerned about what's going to happen with this strike and whether any radical elements are going to radicalize the strikers. And so that's when the black officer, who's a rookie, suddenly becomes very valuable, because unlike the rest of them, he can put on plain clothes and go listen in on these planning meetings at the different venues. You know, there are a couple of big churches where the strikers meet and discuss their plans. And so he does that, being this, you know, dewy-eyed. He's 23 years old. And, you know, the way that I think about it is this. You know, he really had no idea what he was getting caught up in. When he's asked to do this, you know, he says, of course. I mean, well, first of all, I don't think no would have been an acceptable answer, you know, if he wanted to keep his job and not go back to Memphis Sash and Door for $1.60 an hour. Also, he was really thinking about law and order, you know, in this very pure sense of, you know, yes, the same laws, the same rules apply to everybody. Nobody should be disrupting the social order. So if someone's planning to do something that's going to disrupt society, then yes, we need to know about it so that we can stop it. Not realizing that the idea of law and order that ruled the day in his environment was more one of, we're using the law to enforce a particular order, such as the same order that kept the police patrols segregated, that said that you, a black officer, cannot patrol the white neighborhood. That's the order that the law is enforcing. So he was really caught in a riptide that he would have no way of really seeing, you know, he wouldn't have that perspective. But in any event, so he, you know, gradually it goes from listening in on these meetings, these mass meetings, to sidling up to these activists who have made themselves known to law enforcement and others, to becoming part of this group, you know, really kind of insinuating himself in. I mean, he's very good at this work.
He has a car.
He's got a car. This is key, the fastback from the reading, because most of them don't have a car. So he's immediately named their Minister of Transportation. So he's driving them around, listening, you know, the eyes and ears. And so he reports back the truth of what he observes, which is these guys are not a danger to society. They like a little marijuana. They like to talk about Chairman Mao and, you know, Frantz Fanon, but they're not, you know, they're not dangerous. So he reports back the truth of that. But all of this happens from February 1968 through the assassination, which happens in April. And then he's able, even after running up on that balcony and winding up in this photo that's now in the Smithsonian, he's able to continue working undercover until the following spring, I think it was, so, you know, early 1969. And then his cover is blown, and he's got to leave town. He's got to split and go to Cleveland, cool his heels there for a bit until he finds out it's safe for him to come back. So all of that is detailed in these chapters.
Over here? They got the microphone coming.
Oh.
So I'm sure a lot of us have opinions about the quality of the education we received, especially in relation to the civil rights movement. I'm very curious to hear you, as somebody who has both firsthand experience and a lot more expertise than us. How would you describe your education, and how do you react to it based on what you've learned as an adult?
That's a great question, because there's so much. I'm constantly astounded by what I wasn't taught, what wasn't in the books, what wasn't in the curriculum. And, I've got 3 boys now, ranging from junior in high school to first grade. And I don't know, I'm looking at what's in their books. There's a lot that's not in there. But I will say that, there was so much about civil rights history and, Dr. King that wasn't taught. I feel like particularly when it comes to Dr. King, we all hear about I have a dream, and that's usually kind of the beginning and end of what most of us hear. Exactly. And, maybe some schools might do the, Selma, the march or the Pettus Bridge, but that's usually the extent of it. Most of us are not taught about Dr. King's position on Vietnam around the time that he was assassinated, 1967, actually April 4th, 1967, 1 year to the day before he was assassinated, he gave a famous speech at Riverside Church in New York opposing the war in Vietnam, and he got a ton of blowback for that. He lost a lot of support for that. People were very angry, to the highest levels of government even. They don't really talk about that in high school history for the most part. I'd be surprised if most kids are learning about that. So definitely writing this book was an education for me. So much, that I learned. And I think also kind of tying together these historical events to where we are today. And I will say this, I want to shout out my high school history teachers because, they did a great job with what they had. And in particular, there was a program called Facing History and Ourselves, where we learned about, these movements of marginalized people, and specifically we studied the Holocaust, which I think, it's so important to learn these things. So Memphis, Tennessee, Craigmont High School, Elisa Brock, my teacher, thank you so much. You did a stellar job. We did learn about that. And I'm worried right now. I'm worried because of the attacks on history, the attacks on, teaching, quote unquote, controversial topics. In my home state of Tennessee, as far as I'm aware, there's legislation that says that controversial topics can't be taught in, classrooms, certain classrooms. I don't know the particulars of that, but I remember it was a big debate. Imagine that. Controversial topics can't be taught. So, I don't know what they're talking about, but it's probably not that relevant.
There's a question over there.
How does your father feel about your book?
I get that question a lot, and he is thrilled. He's really happy. Yes, we can clap for that because, my position on writing the book was, this is an important story for multiple reasons, including the historical piece. At the same time, I'm very cognizant of what stories are mine to tell and which ones, are his to tell or someone else's. And I really believe in consent, when it comes to these types of matters. And so it was important to me to have his consent. If he hadn't have consented to my sharing all these intimate details, I wouldn't have done it because it was just not worth it to me. This is my father as a human being, and it is his story. But he really wanted to get it out there and let the chips fall and let people, make up their own minds. And people read this book and they have all kinds of different opinions, There are plenty of people that don't agree with what he did, but there are more people who say, wow, you're a hero. But I don't think he was looking for any particular response. He just wanted the story out there and just let people make up their own minds. But he's happy.
My question is somewhat related to that. When in the process of having these conversations with your dad, did you say, hey, I think we have a book here? Was it early on? Were you, through all the conversations? When did you realize that this was more than just talking with your dad?
So funny enough, naive me, the first conversation where I broached this topic, like, hey, Dad, how you doing? The assassination, yeah. I mentioned in that conversation, this should be a book. I just had that idea in my mind, and I've turned this episode over, in the years since, just thinking, why in the world was I so convinced that this should be a book? Did I have any idea what it takes to actually write and publish a book? Like, that is a whole journey in and of itself. But I think what it was that so often, marginalized people don't get to tell their own stories. These stories are often told from a different perspective, through a different lens, that often is not the lens of the people whose lives were really involved. And so I think that from the outset, I always saw it as a book because, I wanted that, that authority as, someone using their own voice and telling the story from their own perspective. I mean, the word author, has the same root as the word authority. And so often, we don't have the authority, the authorial, say over these things. So I just think, subconsciously I had this idea that, we're going to tell this story without it being filtered through some other lens or some person, some mediator.
Since you published the book, oh, you trust me with this? I do. Have there been any connections made with your father and other people that he knew during that time period? So I'm guessing he didn't stay connected to them when he moved on, and have some things come up since.
Yes, some things have come up since. So in the course of researching this book, of course, my job was more than just transcribing what my dad said. I had to go actually kind of corroborate what I could, talk to other people, get some other perspectives. And so in doing that, I ended up having a very long and interesting lunch with one of the co-founders of the Invaders, which was this group that my dad had infiltrated, and this man, Kobe Smith, great person, but he, like everyone else, he didn't know, although he kind of hedges on that. I mean, I think he might. No, he was surprised. Some people say, oh, well, we knew he was an officer. No, Kobe was surprised. But having to have that conversation about, well, here's this guy, you thought he was your minister of transportation, you thought he was your friend, and you find out he's a police officer? Like, what was that like? How do you feel about it? I kind of expected him to be angry, and, I would think that would be a reasonable response. But he wasn't angry at all. He said, I felt like the fact that the Memphis police sent a black officer after us, I thought that was fantastic. Instead of, coming and shooting like with Fred Hampton in Chicago. So that was wonderful news. And then another connection that was made was when I was in Memphis on a radio program talking about the book, and someone called in and said that he was at this historic march that Dr. King led in Memphis. This was the only march that Dr. King ever led, to my knowledge, that ever descended into violence. And it was because of that failed march that Dr. King had to come back and show that he could lead a peaceful march, because he had planned to go on to Washington, D.C. and lead this poor people's campaign. So because this march descended into violence, he had to come back, and it was in that second trip that he was assassinated. But anyway, someone called in and said that he was a teen who had, ditched school to go to this march, and he was the one that started the disorder in that march that led to all the rioting. He said he, picked up something and broke a window, down on Beale Street, and that prompted everybody else to start breaking windows, and things, just the mob, took over kind of thing, just started people doing the same thing, but he was the one who started it. And it was just, I couldn't believe, that this person was listening and had called in. And it was also, and I talked to him a couple times after that, and, I would like to do more with that story, in the coming years. But basically what it did was it put to rest, if this can really be confirmed, and I've done some things to confirm it, but it puts to rest this theory that it was really, the FBI or agence provocateur who started the violence as an excuse to embarrass Dr. King. This man said, no, I did it. It was spontaneous. I was angry. I was a young black teenager in Memphis in this racist society, and I felt powerless, and this was a way for me to express what I was feeling. I'm the one that started the violence, that started the disorder that led to the disastrous march.
we have time for one more question if there is one.
So how long did it take you from the beginning when you said, I'm going to make this a book, and to actually get it done and published? And
Yes. Yes, it was kind of a start and then stop and then start again. So 2010, I have this conversation, hey, let's write a book about this. And so my dad sends me this document, of notes. He says, well, let's just start here. I'm going to send you some notes, read over these, and then we'll go from there. So he sends me this 17-page document. I start reading this document, and it starts with like Tunica, and all of the 12 children, and, Lucille and Walter, the farm. And I got to like page 3, and I could not continue. It was just too overwhelming. And so I put that document aside. I said, I will come back to this when I'm ready. So that was 2010. So I came back to it in 2015 in Incline Village because, long story, but I wound up in Incline. My husband was in Nigeria, and I was with the kids in Incline. I didn't know anybody, and there was nothing for me to do except face this book again. And so I started again in 2015 and worked until 2022, writing, interviewing, Freedom of Information Act requests for FBI documents, all kinds of research. And so, a 7-year process from there.
So, okay, well, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Leta, I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of the foundation and everybody here. This is a wonderful program. We're so grateful to you for joining us. And I'm so grateful to all of you for coming out this evening. You'll be able to see a recording of this program on our website. And if your friends weren't able to make it, let them know that they can see it here too. Our wonderful bookseller partner, Orinda Books, is outside with copies of The Kneeling Man for anyone who hasn't had a chance to purchase it yet. And Leta's gracious enough to sign copies. So she'll be out there after the program. You can catch her there if any questions occur to you. Please be sure to check out our website for upcoming programs. We actually have a second program this month, Music and Meditation, in partnership with the California Symphony. That'll be on Thursday, January 30th. And on Tuesday, February 11th, we will have the fabulous Mark Jordan joining us with a presentation on Henry II and the invasion of Ireland. So I hope to see you all again. And I just want to thank Leta again one more time. Thank you, Lisa. This was a wonderful program. Get home safely. Thanks, everyone.